You watch the news, you see the flashy headlines, and you're probably completely unaware that right behind you, I mean, literally while the world is distracted, the entire geopolitical map of the Middle East is just being aggressively redrawn.
Yeah, it's a massive shift. And crucially, it is not being redrawn by the United States.
Right. It's being drawn by these secret maritime deals, localized choke point negotiations, and just some really unlikely military pacts between historical rivals.
We are witnessing a historic reorganization of power. I mean, the transition from a unipolar world where Washington just dictates the security architecture to this multipolar, fragmented reality, it's accelerating rapidly.
It really is.
And if you only look at the surface-level political theater, the daily press briefings, you completely miss the tectonic plates shifting underneath.
Because it's all happening under the radar.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what our mission is on this deep dive today. We're going to unpack some really incredible insights that were recently shared by geopolitical analysts Trita Parsi and Diesen.
Right, to figure out what these new deals actually mean for you. To understand today's headlines, we have to look past the rhetoric and examine the raw mechanics of leverage.
Exactly. We're exploring who is rapidly gaining power, who is losing their grip, and how this directly impacts the global balance of power. And honestly, this journey is full of these massive aha moments, strategic betrayals, shifting alliances. It rivals any political thriller.
It absolutely does, because the stakes involve the literal machinery of the global economy.
Yeah, the literal machinery.
What Parsi and Diesen's analysis reveals is a decisive move away from a world dominated by a single superpower's security umbrella.
Towards something much more localized, right?
Exactly. Localized and honestly potentially much more volatile. The rules of the game are changing in real time.
So let's just jump straight to the literal choke point of that global economy, the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
Because there's a deal taking shape here between Oman and Iran that just fundamentally challenges decades of assumptions about who controls the seas.
It really upends the whole system.
Right, so let's unpack this. What are Oman and Iran actually doing behind closed doors? I mean, this strait is exactly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. It is the jugular vein of the global energy supply.
Yeah, and historically, the West, particularly the U.S. Navy, has viewed this transit route as a critical international waterway. The assumption was always that it had to remain under a Western security umbrella.
Like the U.S. Fifth Fleet is just the assumed guarantor of traffic flowing.
Right. But now, Oman and Iran have been engaging in these deep back-and-forth negotiations to manage the strait themselves. They are deliberately cutting external powers out of the administrative framework.
Which is wild. So they are looking at a couple of different models for how to pull this off, right? I want to get into the mechanics here. How do you actually rewrite the rules of a major global waterway?
Well, they've been debating two primary models for managing all that maritime traffic. The first model they looked at is a two-lane system.
Okay, like a highway.
Exactly. In this scenario, all inbound traffic entering the Persian Gulf would pass through the northern side, which falls squarely within Iranian territorial waters.
So you'd need Iran's explicit permission to go in.
Right. Direct notification to Iranian maritime authorities. And then all outbound traffic, which is the traffic heavy with crude oil and liquefied natural gas, would travel through a southern channel, routing through Omani waters.
Okay, so that separates it. One lane Iran, one lane Oman.
Yeah, and for a while, this two-lane separation seemed to be the most viable compromise between them.
Which, I mean, even that already shifts the paradigm completely. But there's a second model, right? The one Iran is pushing much harder for.
Yeah, the Iranian preference is vastly more integrated. They want a single unified corridor.
A single corridor.
Right. So instead of separate inbound and outbound lanes hugging their respective coastlines, a single highly regulated channel would physically traverse both Iranian and Omani territorial waters.
So a supertanker would, enter on the Iranian side and then cross over?
Exactly. It would enter Iranian waters, cross over the median line into Omani waters, and then potentially weave back into Iranian waters before exiting, utilizing the exact same corridor for both directions.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting to me. It's the underlying argument Iran is making to justify these models in the first place. Right. Because they aren't just saying, hey, we're a big country next door, so we want to say...
No, not at all.
They are making a foundational legal argument about the very nature of the water itself.
Right. This is key. Iran's foundational argument, which shapes their entire negotiating posture, is that they completely reject the concept of international waters within the Strait of Hormuz.
They just don't acknowledge it exists.
Exactly. In their strict interpretation of maritime law and geography, the strait is so narrow that it consists entirely of overlapping territorial waters.
Oh.
Iran to the north, Oman to the south.
So there is no international corridor in the middle. It's just their property.
That's their argument. By insisting that negotiations about the fate of the strait can only involve the specific sovereign nations whose physical territory makes up the waterway, Iran is forcefully asserting absolute, localized sovereignty.
And they are applying a brutal logic to keep everyone else out of the room.
Hmm.
I remember Parsi and Diesen pointed out that Iran flat out refuses to include other Gulf Cooperation Council countries in these talks, like Bahrain or Kuwait.
Yeah, the GCC is basically shut out. The Iranians are systematically rejecting claims from nations like Kuwait. Kuwait argues, hey, we deserve a seat at the table because our economy completely relies on the strait to import goods and export oil.
Which makes sense from Kuwait's perspective.
It does. But Iran's counter-argument is deeply pragmatic. They point to Beijing and say, well, China has vastly more maritime traffic flowing through this strait than Bahrain or Kuwait could ever dream of.
Oh, wow, that's a good point.
Right. But simply routing cargo through the waterway doesn't grant China administrative rights or a seat at the negotiating table.
So they're saying just because you use it doesn't mean you own it.
Exactly. Therefore, geographic proximity without actual territorial ownership shouldn't grant one to Bahrain or Kuwait either.
It's a very difficult logic to argue against on paper. But wait, if Oman is sitting across the table from Iran, are they really just negotiating for themselves? I mean, Oman is a relatively small player compared to the Saudi or Emirati heavyweights in the region.
Well, Oman's position is a total masterclass in geopolitical tightrope walking. For all practical purposes, Oman is not just negotiating for its own maritime borders.
It's really negotiating for.
They're functioning as a reluctant proxy for the United States and the broader GCC. Their negotiating position constantly fluctuates because they are trying to balance their own vital, localized interests with the intense, often threatening demands of the massive powers standing right over their shoulder.
So what is Oman's internal strategic calculus here? Why take on this incredibly delicate, high-wire act of dealing with Tehran while trying to keep Washington and Riyadh happy? That sounds exhausting.
To understand Oman's maneuvering, you really have to look at their internal dynamics. Oman does not possess the massive, seemingly endless petrodollar wealth that neighbors like Saudi Arabia or the UAE enjoy.
Right, they're structurally much poorer.
Yes. Furthermore, they have a history of geopolitical friction with the Emirates. They often view Abu Dhabi's regional ambitions with deep suspicion.
Okay, so there's some bad blood there.
Exactly. But what Oman lacks in sovereign wealth funds, they make up for in a sheer geographic lottery win. Their physical ownership of the Musandam Peninsula, which juts out to form the southern edge of the Strait of Hormuz, is their ultimate strategic trump card.
Ah, so this negotiation with Iran gives them a way to just punch way above their weight class.
Precisely. If Oman can secure a joint management deal with Iran, it dramatically elevates their importance. It shifts the balance of power within the GCC, giving Oman massive leverage, particularly against the Emirates.
So it's in their best interest to play along.
Yeah, Oman is likely quite motivated to lean toward a position closer to Iran's preferences, like the joint management idea, simply because it maximizes Oman's own strategic indispensability to the rest of the world.
But they still have the United States breathing down their neck the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the U.S. reaction to this Omani-Iranian diplomacy was incredibly fierce.
Oh, the U.S. administration was fundamentally opposed to all the compromise proposals Oman was floating.
Like the shared management or the toll fees.
Right. Washington rejected the idea of shared joint management or imposing administrative environmental service fees. Washington demanded a heavily fortified operational southern corridor entirely confined within Omani waters.
Basically, they wanted a U.S.-protected fast lane.
Exactly. The explicit American goal was to create a route that could remain open and entirely under Western protection, even if an all-out war broke out with Iran. They wanted an ironclad guarantee that Iran could never close the strait.
And the pressure campaign on Oman was just wild. I mean, Donald Trump, during his presidency, literally went on social media and threatened to, quote, blow them up if Oman didn't behave.
Yes, very public, very aggressive threats.
And then you had Senator Marco Rubio flying to the region. And it wasn't a friendly diplomatic visit, right? He arrived threatening Oman with severe, crippling economic sanctions if they didn't immediately abandon the joint management idea and adopt the American position.
It was an intense campaign of strong-arming. The U.S. was deploying the full weight of its diplomatic and economic arsenal. They were demanding that a sovereign nation abandon its own diplomatic progress and just fall strictly in line with Washington's security dictates.
You know, I can't help to think of this like a shared driveway dispute in a suburban neighborhood.
A shared driveway.
Yeah, imagine you and your neighbor own houses facing each other, and you share one long driveway out to the main public road. The two of you get together, you survey the property lines, and decide, hey, we legally own this asphalt. Let's put up a gate to manage who drives up here, maybe split the cost of repaving.
Okay, I follow.
And then the president of the Homeowners Association, that's the United States in this scenario, is standing on the public sidewalk, just absolutely losing their mind. They are screaming at you, threatening to fine you, threatening to revoke your neighborhood pool privileges.
Right, applying all the pressure they have.
But at the end of the day, the HOA president doesn't legally own the driveway, and they don't have the physical authority to stop you from building the gate on your own property.
That analogy is incredibly apt, especially when you look at the aftermath of that U.S. pressure campaign. Because despite the unprecedented social media threats from the Oval Office, despite the high-level senatorial visits threatening economic ruin, weeks passed. The dust settled.
And what happened?
The situation simply drifted right back toward the original Iranian and Omani position. The bilateral negotiations quietly continued, firmly rooted in the premise of joint management and mutual territorial sovereignty.
Wow, which is just a massive reality check for Washington.
It is a stark, undeniable revelation of the limits of American influence in the modern era. The U.S. attempted to dictate terms through aggressive rhetoric and economic threats in one of the most vital global choke points, and they completely failed to change the fundamental trajectory of the agreement.
The old playbook just didn't work.
Exactly. The traditional levers of American hegemonic power sanctions and military posturing are no longer automatically producing the desired subservience.
So if the U.S. is failing to dictate terms in the Strait of Hormuz, we really need to take a step back and look at the underlying logic of American strategy here. Why is America so obsessed with controlling this specific waterway in the first place? I mean, is direct American control actually essential for global security, or is Washington operating on an outdated set of assumptions?
Answering that requires us to cleanly separate two different strategic concepts. Concepts that have become deeply, inextricably tangled together in Washington's foreign policy consensus. We need to critically deconflate U.S. interests in the region.
Let's break that down. How are the analysts separating those interests?
Well, the primary U.S. interest, the vital absolute goal for global stability, is keeping the waterway open so that international trade, particularly energy, can flow in a predictable, non-discriminatory manner.
Right, make sure the oil keeps moving so the global economy doesn't collapse.
Exactly. That flow prevents economic disaster. However, over the past several decades, a secondary interest has been elevated to the exact same level of importance.
And what's that?
The intense desire to maintain direct, administrative American military control over the waterway, specifically in order to deprive a hostile power like Iran of any geopolitical leverage.
So Washington has completely confused the goal, which is free-flowing trade, with the method, which is direct American military dominance.
Precisely. Policymakers often operate under the assumption that a waterway isn't truly open or safe unless a U.S. carrier strike group is actively managing it.
But historically, that hasn't been the prerequisite for stable trade, has it?
No, not at all. The primary interest is solely the unimpeded flow of commodities. If that flow can be reliably guaranteed, even by a country that is openly hostile to the U.S., the core economic interest is still fundamentally met.
I know Parsi and Diesen brought up a brilliant historical comparison to illustrate this, going all the way back to 1956 and the Suez Canal crisis.
Yeah.
Walk us through how President Eisenhower handled that, because the parallels are just fascinating.
They really are. So, in 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser boldly asserted sovereignty and nationalized the Suez Canal. He physically took administrative control away from the British and French corporate interests that had managed it for decades.
And Egypt at the time wasn't exactly a close American friend.
Far from it. Egypt was actively moving closer to the Soviet Union. They were purchasing Soviet arms and were widely considered a hostile or at least deeply problematic power by the Western alliance.
So naturally, France, the UK, and Israel viewed Nasser's move as an existential threat to global trade. I mean, they literally went to war, launching a coordinated military invasion to seize the canal back.
Right, and they launched that invasion operating under the exact same logic we see today. A critical choke point cannot be left in the hands of a hostile actor.
But this is where it gets crazy.
This is where President Eisenhower executed a strategic masterstroke that shocked his own allies. The United States did not side with its traditional NATO partners, France and the UK.
Which seems unthinkable today.
Completely unthinkable. Instead, the Eisenhower administration applied crushing economic and political pressure on London, Paris, and Israel to immediately halt the invasion and withdraw. He effectively sided with Soviet-aligned Egypt.
Siding against your closest historical allies in favor of a Soviet-leaning state managing a vital choke point seems like political suicide. Why did Eisenhower do it? What did he see that the British and French didn't?
Eisenhower recognized that Egypt, despite its Soviet leanings and hostility toward Western imperialism, fundamentally guaranteed the free flow of trade through the canal.
Because Egypt needed the money.
Exactly. Nasser needed the transit revenue just as much as Europe needed the oil. The U.S. administration realized that Egyptian sovereignty over the canal did not jeopardize the primary interest of open shipping lanes.
Wow.
Now, it was a massive, humiliating blow to British and French imperial prestige. It effectively ended their status as top-tier global superpowers.
But it proved a point.
It proved a crucial geopolitical lesson. The United States can thrive while a hostile power manages a critical waterway, provided that the primary interest of free-flowing trade is organically secured by mutual economic need.
So applying that 1956 lesson to today, the argument is that as long as Iran and Oman ensure the tankers keep moving, which, let's be real, Iran desperately wants, because their entire economy relies on exporting their own oil to places like China, the U.S. shouldn't view joint Iranian-Omani management of Hormuz as a reason to start World War III.
That is exactly the point. The secondary interest of actively depriving Iran of maritime control should not supersede the primary interest of keeping the global economy moving, especially if reasserting American control requires a devastating multi-trillion-dollar regional war.
Okay, let me play the devil's advocate for a second here, just channeling the defense hawks in Washington. Because something happened recently that terrified a lot of policymakers. The recent flare-ups in the region, the skirmishes and proxy attacks, they demonstrated clearly that Iran can disrupt shipping if they choose to.
Yes, they did.
So doesn't that physical reality prove the U.S. Navy needs to step in and forcefully neutralize that threat?
Well, the analytical framework presented by Parsi and Diesen makes a vital distinction regarding those recent events. The recent conflict didn't give Iran the ability to close or disrupt the strait.
It just showed what they already had.
Exactly. It merely revealed that they possessed the capacity all along. The capability was already baked into the geography.
So the anti-ship missiles, the drones, that wasn't new.
The reality of Iranian asymmetric maritime capability, their fast attack swarms, anti-ship ballistic missiles hidden in the mountains, advanced mining capabilities, it was always there, quietly maturing. Neither the U.S. intelligence apparatus nor the Iranian leadership themselves fully realized the absolute extent and effectiveness of this capability until it was tangibly tested in recent flare-ups.
So we are just catching up to reality.
Right. Acknowledging the reality that Iran can severely disrupt the strait isn't granting them a new diplomatic concession. It is simply waking up to a geographical and military fact that existed long prior to any recent escalations.
Okay, but I still have to push back on this from a grand strategic level. If I'm sitting in the Pentagon looking at the grand chessboard of global power, my entire job is deterrence. Geopolitical strategists like Zbigniew Brzezinski have pointed out for decades that American global hegemony relies on the implicit threat that the U.S. controls the world's arteries.
The Brzezinski Doctrine, yes.
Right. We signaled to China, don't cross us over Taiwan, or we'll shut down your energy imports through the Strait of Malacca. We signaled to Russia, don't cross us, or we'll lock down the Baltic Sea. If the U.S. just throws up its hands and says, sure, Iran, you manage Hormuz, we're going home, doesn't this entirely neuter U.S. deterrence? Doesn't it unravel the whole hegemonic system built since World War II?
Proponents of maintaining total American primacy make that exact argument. And they are entirely wrong on the theory. Stepping back from Hormuz absolutely undermines that specific brand of aggressive global hegemonic posturing.
Right.
But we're forced to analyze this against the stark reality of America's rapidly shifting military capacity and the changing nature of the global energy map. The strategy of total control is colliding with the limits of physical resources.
So the idea that the U.S. can play the world's policeman everywhere simultaneously is just mathematically false now.
It is mathematically impossible at this stage. The analysis details how the U.S. is currently severely depleting its critical defensive and offensive resources.
What kind of resource?
We are talking about the rapid drawdown of Patriot missile batteries, TAE anti-ballistic missile systems, and finite offensive munitions like Tomahawk cruise missiles.
Which aren't cheap or easy to make.
Exactly. These assets take years and massive industrial capacity to replace. And where are they being depleted? In ongoing conflicts in Eastern Europe and localized skirmishes in the Middle East, all while the Pentagon is simultaneously trying to pivot those exact same resources to much more vital strategic arenas like the South China Sea to maintain parity with a rapidly expanding Chinese Navy.
So they are just stretched to the breaking point.
They are. The current administration cannot mobilize 500,000 troops for a massive, bloody ground invasion of southern Iran just to dictate the administrative toll collection terms of a strait.
The public would never go for it.
They lack the logistical capacity for a multi-front war of that scale, and they certainly cannot sell that kind of devastating, open-ended quagmire to an American public that is deeply wary of Middle Eastern interventions.
And the economic data fully supports the public's reluctance to get involved, too. Parsi and Diesen brought up some hard numbers regarding the waning importance of the Persian Gulf that completely reframed the argument for me.
The strategic calculus driving American foreign policy is fundamentally changing because the global economic map has been redrawn over the last 2 decades. Go back 20 or 25 years. At the height of the War on Terror and the Iraq War, roughly 40% of the world's globally traded oil flowed through the Strait of Hormuz.
40%. It was the undisputed single point of failure for the global economy.
Exactly.
And today, where does that number sit?
Today, it has plummeted to roughly 21 or 22%.
That is a staggering reduction in strategic importance, nearly cut in half. What drove such a massive decrease in reliance on that specific waterway?
It is a combination of massive global shifts. First, you have new players on the board. Countries like Brazil are now tapping into massive offshore reserves. They are pumping nearly 5 million barrels of oil a day, which is significantly more than Iran is currently producing.
Wow, Brazil is producing more than Iran. I didn't know that.
Yes. Second, the massive shale oil and fracking explosion within the United States has made North America a net energy exporter. That drastically reduced Western reliance on Gulf crude.
Right, the U.S. doesn't need it as much.
And looking forward, major infrastructure investments are being made in massive bypass pipelines across the Arabian Peninsula.
So they are physically building around the problem.
Exactly. These pipelines will route Saudi and Emirati oil directly overland to the Red Sea, entirely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz.
Now, obviously, the Red Sea has its own massive security issues right now with the Houthis and the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait, but the point is, alternatives are being built.
Right. Those specific overland pipelines might take another 10 years to reach full operational capacity, but the geopolitical trend line is undeniable. The singular, world-ending significance of the Strait of Hormuz is steadily deflating.
So going to war over it just doesn't make sense anymore.
Sacrificing finite American munitions, risking a catastrophic regional war, and trying to mobilize 500,000 troops for a choke point that is half as important as it was 2 decades ago, it's a strategy devoid of rational cost-benefit analysis. The alternative cost of fighting a war for control of Hormuz would fatally compromise the U.S.'s ability to address existential conflicts elsewhere.
And the countries actually living in the Middle East, they aren't blind to this reality either. They see the exact same data on U.S. munitions depletion. They know the American security umbrella is looking increasingly threadbare, stretched dangerously thin, and frankly, from their perspective, erratic.
Very erratic.
Because they see Washington stepping back, regional powers are taking matters into their own hands, which is leading to some truly strange new bedfellows. Let's examine this new security umbrella, specifically the defense pact emerging between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan.
This development signals a profound structural lack of faith in American security guarantees. We are observing the formation of a new defense pact signed between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan, deeply rooted in the principle that an attack on one is considered an attack on all.
They are essentially mimicking NATO's Article 5, but for a totally different set of actors in a completely different neighborhood.
Exactly.
What's wild to me is that these 3 countries have incredibly distinct, almost mismatched incentives for doing this. I mean, they don't form a natural, cohesive geopolitical bloc.
The distinct incentives really reveal a marriage of sheer convenience and shared vulnerability. Take Pakistan. Pakistan possesses significant battle-tested military means. They have one of the largest standing armies in the world, and, crucially, they provide a nuclear umbrella.
So they have the muscle.
But their domestic economy frequently teeters on the edge of collapse. They lack deep financial resources to sustain long-term power projection.
So Pakistan has the nukes and the troops, but no money.
Right. Then you have Saudi Arabia, representing the exact inverse. Under Vision 2030 and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudis have nearly limitless sovereign wealth and financing capabilities.
The ultimate checkbook.
But despite spending hundreds of billions on advanced American weaponry, their historical military performance, most notably the long, grueling campaign in Yemen, demonstrated a profound inability to unilaterally secure their borders against asymmetric threats.
Okay, so Pakistan brings the nuclear muscle and the manpower. Saudi Arabia brings the endless checkbook to fund it. That makes sense as a trade. But what about Turkey? Turkey is a massive industrialized nation with a strong military. Where do they fit into this triad?
Turkey's calculus is fascinating. It's highly indicative of the current geopolitical anxiety sweeping the region. Turkey is a formalized member of NATO, possessing the second-largest army in the alliance, yet they are actively participating in this parallel pact because Ankara increasingly distrusts NATO's reliability and Washington's long-term intentions.
So they are hedging their bets.
Strongly. More specifically, driven by neo-Ottoman ambitions and a desire for regional hegemony, they fear future aggression and destabilization efforts from Israel.
Israel and Turkey. I mean, I know they've had intense diplomatic spats and severed ties over incidents like the Gaza flotilla years ago, but actual military conflict. Is Ankara really worried about that?
The analysis highlights a very specific historical pattern of geopolitical pivoting that terrifies Ankara. It notes that at moments in the past when Israeli leadership believed they had successfully contained, isolated, or neutralized a major regional threat, they immediately began framing Turkish President Erdogan as the next massive destabilizing force.
Really?
Yes, sometimes calling him the, quote, most dangerous person in the Middle East. There is a deep-seated perception in Ankara that once one rival is down, Israel immediately pivots its powerful Western lobbying apparatus to designate the next rising regional power as the primary existential threat.
You know, this mirrors exactly what happened back in 1991. Before the Gulf War, Israel and Iran actually had quiet back-channel alignments. Israel saw Iran as a useful non-Arab friend to balance against hostile Arab states like Iraq.
Right, the periphery doctrine.
Exactly. But the second the geopolitical map shifted, the Soviet Union fell, and Saddam Hussein's military was decimated in the Gulf War. Israel abruptly flipped the script. With Iraq no longer a threat, Israel immediately started portraying Iran as the ultimate existential danger to the world. Turkey is looking at that exact history and thinking, if Iran gets neutralized, we are absolutely next on the target list.
The historical precedent drives the paranoia. So you have three very different actors: Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, driven by acute financial desperation, stark military vulnerability, and a profound distrust of shifting Western alliances, coming together to aggressively form their own independent security architecture.
It's like discovering your primary life and home insurance policy is written by a highly unpredictable, potentially bankrupt company that occasionally changes the terms of your coverage without telling you.
That's a good way to put it.
You don't necessarily call them up and cancel the policy today, but you immediately start signing secondary, localized policies with your well-armed neighbors, just in case the roof caves in and the main company refuses to answer the phone.
And the premiums on these secondary localized policies are being paid in major geopolitical concessions. This pact is not intended to completely replace the U.S. security umbrella overnight. It serves as a complementary secondary policy.
Just a backup plan.
Right. It exists because leadership in Riyadh, Ankara, and Islamabad understands that American foreign policy decision-making has become hyper-partisan, erratic, and deeply unpredictable. Relying solely on American guarantees is now viewed as an unacceptable national security risk.
But is countries taking responsibility for their own neighborhood actually a bad thing? On paper, it sounds like a stabilizing move. Hey, we'll police ourselves. Yet the experts issue a pretty stark warning about this specific type of alliance formation.
The severe danger lies in the inherent nature of what strategists call bloc formations. If this new pact between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan merely serves as an exclusionary regional bloc designed explicitly to balance against and contain Iran, essentially stepping in to replace the U.S. in that hostile containment role, it guarantees perpetual friction and the eventual outbreak of war.
Because it just changes who Iran is pointing their missiles at in a standoff, not the fact that there is a standoff in the first place.
Precisely. Swapping the primary adversary while maintaining the underlying architecture of hostility solves nothing. The analysts contrast this dangerous bloc formation with a much more difficult but ultimately stable solution: an indivisible security architecture.
When they talk about indivisible security, it sounds almost utopian. Are we basically talking about forcing bitter historical rivals into a shared defense pact? Like everyone just gets along.
It requires creating a collective security arrangement that explicitly includes your rivals rather than organizing against them.
Okay, how does that work historically?
The historical parallel drawn here is the pan-European security architecture discussions of the 1970s and early 1990s, centered around the Helsinki Accords and the OSCE.
Right, during the Cold War.
During the Cold War détente and immediately after the Soviet collapse, there was a concerted effort in Europe to create a security system that actively included Russia. The theory of indivisible security argues that no single state can increase its own security at the direct expense of another state's security.
And we all know how that turned out in Europe. The West largely abandoned that inclusive Helsinki model in favor of rapid NATO expansion right up to Russia's borders. And now we have the largest land war in Europe since 1945.
The warning is that the Middle East is currently standing at that exact same historical crossroads. If Saudi Arabia and Turkey build exclusionary, heavily armed blocs aimed at isolating Iran, they are laying the groundwork for a catastrophic future war.
So they need a different approach.
The only true path to long-term stability is a comprehensive Helsinki-style arrangement where the security needs of Riyadh, Ankara, and Tehran are explicitly linked and mutually assured through binding diplomatic and economic integration.
Which makes the current actions of the United States seem even more baffling, honestly. Yeah. Because while Saudi Arabia is off building these secondary insurance alliances with Turkey and Pakistan, Washington is desperately trying to reel the Saudis back into the American fold. And they are using a massive, highly controversial carrot to do it. Let's examine the looming U.S.-Saudi nuclear deal.
This is perhaps one of the most volatile and contradictory developments discussed in the analysis. The U.S. is in the final stages of negotiating a sweeping generational security deal with Saudi Arabia.
A deal that keeps changing, right?
Yes. Notably, this current iteration of the deal appears to decouple Saudi normalization from the Palestinian issue, largely cutting Israel's immediate political demands out of the equation. But the most alarming aspect is the technological concession.
And what is that?
Washington is proposing to provide Saudi Arabia with advanced domestic nuclear enrichment technology, reportedly with zero binding international inspections attached.
Okay, let's unpack this hypocrisy because my head is just spinning right now. The United States has spent the last 40 to 50 years doing everything in its immense power-crippling economic sanctions that impoverished millions, covert cyber attacks like Stuxnet, and essentially going to the very brink of all-out war multiple times, specifically to stop Iran from acquiring this exact same nuclear enrichment technology.
Yes, decades of maximum pressure.
And now, under an America First justification, the White House is preparing to just hand the keys to a nuclear pathway over to Saudi Arabia without even requiring the baseline JCPOA-style international inspections. I mean, how is that real?
The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, mandated the most intrusive, comprehensive International Atomic Energy Agency inspections in history. The whole point was to ensure Iran's enrichment remained strictly at civilian levels, extending their breakout time to build a weapon to over a year.
It was incredibly strict.
Exactly. Offering Saudi Arabia enrichment technology without those exact same safeguards completely undermines any diplomatic leverage or moral authority the U.S. has left. As the analysts state bluntly, it is diplomatic insanity.
How can an American diplomat look the Iranians in the eye and say, you must agree to a strict permanent moratorium on any advanced uranium enrichment, and you must submit to 24/7 invasive international monitoring, while simultaneously pointing across the Gulf to Riyadh and saying, but they get a free pass to spin centrifuges in the dark because they buy our fighter jets?
They can't. It creates an impossible totally unworkable negotiating position. If you attempt to establish a regional security architecture based on the premise that the superpower gets to write special, highly lenient rules for countries it deems obedient, while enforcing a completely different draconian set of rules for those who resist U.S. hegemony, you guarantee structural instability.
It just breeds resentment.
Iran or any sovereign nation in their position will never accept a deal under those blatantly unequal conditions.
Beyond just torpedoing the Iran talks, isn't there a massive existential danger in giving Saudi Arabia this technology in the first place? When you give a country the domestic fuel cycle, the centrifuges and the uranium, you give them everything they need for a weapons program. What's to stop Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman from waking up one day and deciding to build a bomb?
This leads us directly into what we can call the security guarantee trap.
The security guarantee trap. Okay, explain that.
When we look at historical proliferation, a very clear pattern emerges. When countries acquire domestic nuclear enrichment capabilities, which is the absolute prerequisite pathway to building a nuclear weapon, they almost inevitably use that newly acquired, terrifying capability to strong-arm global superpowers into offering them ironclad, binding security guarantees.
It's essentially state-level extortion.
It really is.
It's like handing a rival faction the blueprints and the access codes to a massive bank vault and just asking them to promise not to go inside. Eventually, they're going to hold those blueprints over your head and say, protect us from the police, give us everything we want, or we open the vault.
It forces the superpower's hand entirely. If the U.S. provides Saudi Arabia the enrichment technology today, it is a historical certainty that Saudi Arabia will eventually turn around and say, give us a formal, binding, treaty-level defense pact where American soldiers are legally obligated to die to protect our borders, or we will spin up these centrifuges to weapons grade.
Wow, so they use the threat of a bomb to buy an American military shield.
Exactly. And this is disastrous because it actively works against the overarching strategic need for the United States to pivot its resources toward Asia and disentangle itself from Middle Eastern conflicts. By granting the nuclear technology, the U.S. is inadvertently ensuring that it will be dragged back into defending the Arabian Peninsula for decades to come, simply to prevent a Saudi nuclear breakout.
So with the U.S. playing blatant favorites with nuclear technology and neighbors like Saudi Arabia and Turkey forming military blocs, we really have to look inside Iran to see how they're calculating their next move. If Washington is actively handing Saudi Arabia the keys to nuclear enrichment, how does Tehran react to seeing their biggest rival get a free pass?
It creates a highly volatile internal debate.
Will they see the writing on the wall and lean into quiet diplomacy, or will they unleash their hardliners?
Oh.
Let's dive into Iran's internal calculus and the vengeance trap.
The internal political dynamics within Iran are crucial to understanding the next phase of this conflict. The Iranian leadership is not a monolith. They have options, and those options pull the country in very different, highly consequential directions.
Right.
On one hand, you have a very powerful, highly mobilized push from the hardline factions within the Majlis, the Iranian parliament.
What are the hardliners proposing in response to all this external pressure? Because they usually don't just sit quietly.
No, they don't. The newly seated parliament, which is dominated by ultra-conservatives and was largely out of session during the immediate kinetic conflicts earlier in the year, is now back and actively throwing its weight around. They're pushing highly aggressive escalatory legislation.
Like what?
For example, they have proposed bills aimed at strictly limiting or outright blocking any Israeli shipping, or any international ships carrying cargo that ultimately benefits the Israeli economy from passing through the Strait of Hormuz.
That is an incredibly provocative stance that essentially forces a military confrontation in the strait.
Yes. Furthermore, they're drafting legislation demanding massive, multi-billion-dollar economic reparations for past American actions.
And it's not just legislative grandstanding either. We've seen recent military actions like the drone and missile strikes on targets in Jordan that point to this exact hardline strategy.
The strikes on Jordan and similar kinetic actions utilizing their network of regional proxies are analyzed as part of a deliberate hardliner strategy aimed at publicly humiliating the United States.
Trying to make the U.S. look weak.
They want to demonstrate American impotence to protect its regional allies. The underlying goal of these hardliners is to apply so much relentless pressure that regional players, like Jordan, the UAE, or Bahrain, get terrified of the collateral damage and decide to proactively sever their security ties with America to avoid getting caught in the crossfire.
They want a maximalist victory. They just want to kick the U.S. out of the Middle East entirely through brute force. But Parsi and Diesen highlighted a massive, bizarre dilemma for Iran right now regarding their soft power.
It is one of the most remarkable and unexpected shifts in regional dynamics we've seen in a long time.
Why happen?
Over the course of the recent conflicts, primarily due to the catastrophic humanitarian disasters unfolding in Gaza and the widely perceived hypocrisy of the Western response, Iran has bizarrely accumulated a significant degree of regional soft power.
Really, like actual popular support.
Yes, grassroots empathy across the Arab Street that we haven't really seen since the 1979 revolution.
Iran gaining soft power among Sunni Arab populations is a massive paradigm shift.
Yeah.
But I have to observe something here and push back on the viability of this hardliner strategy. I get that vengeance against the United States feels incredibly satisfying to the Iranian public. There's deep, lingering anger over the Trump administration unilaterally abandoning the JCPOA, imposing maximum pressure sanctions, and assassinating General Qasem Soleimani.
The anger is very real and very potent.
But by pushing these extreme bills and launching strikes, aren't they running a huge risk of completely overplaying their hand?
Absolutely, and that is the core of the danger for Tehran. If the Iranian parliament forces the executive branch into an aggressive, uncompromising maximalist stance, they will completely squander this newly acquired soft power.
It's like shooting themselves in the foot.
The analysts note that parliaments often engage in this kind of self-sabotage, comparing the Majlis to how the U.S. Congress frequently uses the blunt instrument of new sanctions to intentionally tank delicate, ongoing diplomatic negotiations.
If they lean into the hardline aggression, they'll just remind everyone in the region why they were terrified of Iranian proxies in the first place.
And the consequences are far worse than just losing a public relations battle. Leaning into vengeance will fundamentally validate the deepest fears of their neighbors. It will provide the exact justification Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan need to rapidly accelerate and solidify their new defense bloc.
It becomes a tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy.
If Iran chooses the vengeance trap, they guarantee that they will remain surrounded by a highly organized, heavily armed coalition of hostile rivals. They will have successfully traded the distant, stretched thin American hegemonic threat for a very localized, very immediate nuclear-armed threat right on their borders.
And just infinitely worse for them.
They will completely fail to achieve the stable, inclusive neighborhood that is required for their own economic survival.
It is an incredibly delicate balancing act for Tehran. But as if the Middle East wasn't a complex enough powder keg with all these localized deals, nuclear hypocrisies, and vengeance traps, there's an active, high-level effort happening right now to pour gasoline on the fire by tying this entire conflict directly into the war in Europe.
This is a critical point.
This brings us to the ultimate escalation, merging the wars.
This is perhaps the most dangerous geopolitical maneuver currently being lobbied for in Washington. We are examining a grand strategy explicitly pushed by Ukrainian leadership, particularly President Zelensky's inner circle, to seamlessly merge the brutal land war in Ukraine and the maritime proxy conflicts in the Middle East involving Iran into a single, unified narrative framework.
How on earth do you successfully merge a trench war in Eastern Europe with a maritime conflict in the Persian Gulf? What is the logical bridge they're trying to build there?
The bridge is built on the logic of a unified global axis of adversaries. The Ukrainian narrative being heavily pushed to Western lawmakers and think tanks is straightforward. They are saying, look, we are fighting the exact same enemies in both theaters.
Because Russia and Iran are working together.
Right. Russia and Iran are deeply partnered. They are actively providing each other with Shahed drones, ballistic missiles, and vital geopolitical cover. Therefore, the West is not fighting two separate, distinct regional wars. It is fighting the exact same global war against the same axis of authoritarian enemies.
But why would Ukraine want to broaden their war? Why would they want to formally declare a state of hostility with Iran, drawing Iranian intelligence and resources into the fight when they're already struggling to hold the line against Russia?
It's a deeply calculated, immensely risky gamble for survival. The Ukrainian strategic logic is that they are willing to risk severe military overextension by antagonizing Iran if, and this is the defining if, that unified narrative successfully draws the United States military into direct kinetic participation against Russia.
Ah, the geopolitical bang shot.
Yeah.
They figure the U.S. public and administration are highly hesitant to fight a nuclear-armed Russia directly, but Washington is historically much more eager and politically primed to fight Iran.
Exactly.
So if you inextricably tie Russia and Iran together into one entity, the U.S. gets dragged into fighting in Ukraine via their long-standing hatred of Iran.
That is the gambit. Ukraine has sought deeper, direct U.S. military involvement like no-fly zones, direct troop deployments from the very beginning of the invasion. However, this is a massive gamble, and the analysis notes that even some senior Ukrainian military and security officials, formerly including figures like General Zaluzhny, were deeply apprehensive about Zelensky's strategy.
Why are his own military commanders pushing back against a strategy designed to get them more American support?
Because military commanders evaluate strategy based on a tangible return on investment, and they view this as wildly negative. They fear that Ukraine will unnecessarily antagonize Iran, drawing vast Iranian drone and missile resources and potentially even proxy fighters directly onto the Ukrainian battlefield.
Which they can't afford to deal with right now.
They risk suffering the devastating consequences of massive overextension without actually succeeding in dragging the American military into a direct shooting war with Russia. They take on all the immense risk of a multi-front war with absolutely no guarantee of the American cavalry actually arriving.
President Zelensky actually visited Washington to pitch this unified axis idea to Congress and the administration. While the White House seemed to rebuff the idea of a formal grand declaration merging the wars, the analysts issued a really terrifying warning about the 1,000 paper cuts. What does that mean in this context?
It means that the ultimate escalation doesn't require a dramatic press conference or a formal declaration of World War III. Even if the U.S. administration firmly rejects a grand, formal announcement that the wars are merged, the profound danger lies deep within the national security bureaucracy.
Oh, so?
The merging of the wars will happen imperceptibly, day by day, through 1,000 small, seemingly isolated, incremental decisions.
Just slow bureaucratic mission creep.
Exactly. A shared intelligence agreement between Kyiv and Jerusalem here, a joint targeting package developed against Iranian drone factories there, rerouting critical weapons shipments to address both the Russian and Iranian threats simultaneously through a unified command structure.
So it just blends together over time.
Before you know it, the entire U.S. military, intelligence, and diplomatic apparatus is functionally treating the two distinct theaters as a single, massive, interconnected conflict. The U.S. gets dragged into an intractable, multi-continent war, not by a dramatic vote in Congress, but by the slow accumulation of administrative paper cuts.
I have to ask a crucial question here regarding the domestic politics of all this.
Yeah.
Where does Israel fit into this massive reshaping of the map? We've talked about Oman, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Ukraine. Israel seems awfully quiet during all these Saudi nuclear negotiations and Omani maritime deals. What is their strategic play right now amidst all this chaos?
While Israel is currently dealing with unprecedented internal political turbulence and massive security failures, on the grand strategic level, the idea of formally merging the Ukraine and Iran wars is described by analysts as Israel's absolute dream scenario.
Really? Why is merging the wars such a massive strategic windfall for Israel?
Look at the current deeply fractured political reality in the United States and across Europe. The U.S. administration faces massive, unprecedented domestic blowback, protests, and electoral peril from its own political base for funding and arming a war that is seen by many solely as defending controversial Israeli policies.
Especially given the staggering civilian casualties.
Right. The political digestibility of sending billions in weapons to Israel is plummeting rapidly.
The fracture in the Democratic base over this is undeniable. It's a huge political liability.
Now imagine if the narrative successfully shifts. Imagine if defeating Iran and its proxies is no longer framed to the Western public as defending Israel, but is completely reframed as defending Ukraine and fighting back against Vladimir Putin's broader axis of Russian aggression.
That completely flips the script. It weaponizes the immense popularity of the Ukrainian cause.
The political digestibility in European capitals and in Washington changes overnight. It fundamentally splits the progressive base in the U.S. because those who are highly critical of Israeli policy are often still deeply committed to supporting Ukraine's defense against Russia.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly strategic.
By merging the wars, you revitalize the flow of Western arms and funding against Iran under a much more popular, palatable, and morally unambiguous banner. Israel sees this as an incredible opportunity to secure continued, massive Western military engagement against their primary regional rival, Iran, without having to bear the brunt of the immense geopolitical PR nightmare they are currently facing.
That is an incredible, almost Machiavellian chess move that really puts everything into perspective. We're watching a masterclass in narrative manipulation. So let's pull all these disparate threads together as we wrap up this deep dive. The overarching theme of this entire conversation, analyzing the profound shifts detailed by Trita Parsi and Diesen is overwhelmingly clear. The era of unchecked American unipolarity is over.
It is definitively over.
Yeah. The era where Washington could simply snap its fingers, deploy a carrier strike group, and dictate the security architecture of the Middle East is finished.
The mechanics of global power are recalibrating away from Washington. We are observing a United States that is running dangerously low on critical high-end munitions, stretched far too thin by competing global commitments in Europe and Asia, and entirely incapable of selling new massive ground wars to a deeply skeptical public.
And geopolitics abhors a vacuum. Because the U.S. is stepping back or being pushed back by the sheer math of their resource depletion, regional powers are aggressively writing their own rules. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan are drafting their own independent defense pact.
Without American input.
And most tellingly, the absolute most critical maritime choke points on the globe, like the Strait of Hormuz, are actively being managed by localized agreements between historical rivals like Oman and Iran. They are deliberately cutting Western superpowers entirely out of the room.
The local actors are looking at the hard, mathematical realities of military leverage and geographic proximity, rather than relying on the outdated, increasingly hollow promises of distant hegemonic powers.
And this matters to you, the listener, right now. Because this isn't just a bunch of lines changing on a map in a distant desert or theoretical debates in a think tank. These localized maritime deals, these shifting power structures, directly determine global energy prices.
Absolutely.
They dictate the stability of the supply chains that stock the shelves at your local grocery store and power the grid in your city. And if the narratives surrounding Ukraine and Iran successfully merge in the halls of Washington, these shifts determine whether your own country's military gets slowly, imperceptibly dragged into a multi-continent World War III scenario by 1,000 bureaucratic paper cuts.
The distance between a localized waterway negotiation in the Persian Gulf and the broader stability of the global economy has never been shorter.
Which brings us back to where you started. We were sitting in that living room watching the neighborhood lines get redrawn by people we barely recognize. So I want to leave you with a lingering thought, something to deeply mull over on your own as you watch the news headlines scroll by this week.
It's a big question.
If the future of global security is no longer enforced by the iron fist of one massive superpower's military, but instead relies on a messy, shifting, highly volatile patchwork of ad hoc regional alliances, secondary insurance pacts, and localized choke point tolls, does that actually make the world more democratic, more representative, and ultimately more stable? Or are we simply returning to a precarious pre-World War I era, where a single localized misunderstanding in a shared waterway could spark an uncontrollable global fire? Keep your eyes on the choke points. Until next time.